You know, what happens when the perfect solution to your biggest problem ends up becoming an even bigger one? Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating moment in history where a brand new nation just trying to hold itself together made a risky bet that would completely redraw the map of North America and, honestly, set the stage for decades to come.
All right, so let's set the scene. We're back in the 1820s. Mexico is fresh off its war for independence, and it is struggling with a huge problem. How do you actually govern this enormous territory? And one area in particular, this massive state you see here, Coahuila y Tejas, was a real challenge. It was this vast, sprawling, and pretty much empty frontier.
To really get what's happening, you have to appreciate the sheer scale of the problems facing Mexico right out of the gate. I mean, this wasn't just about drawing new borders. It was the incredibly messy, difficult work of building a stable country from the ground up.
So, after a super short experiment with having its own emperor, Mexico's first government collapsed, and things got chaotic. In Mexico City, different political groups were constantly fighting over how the country should even be run. And while they were arguing, trying to control this huge, diverse land was getting harder and harder, especially way up north, where the regions felt basically no connection to the capital.
And from the government's perspective down in Mexico City, Texas was just the ultimate headache. I mean, look at it. It was enormous, it was so far away from the center of power, and crucially, it was almost completely empty of Mexican citizens. That made it incredibly vulnerable and nearly impossible to actually govern.
So, what do? Well, Mexican leaders came up with a pretty bold, if really risky, solution. They absolutely had to get people into Texas to secure that frontier. And they figured, hey, if we can't do it with our own people, maybe someone else can.
And that plan was what's called a colonization policy. The idea was actually pretty straightforward. Let's invite foreigners, who were mostly from the United States, to come and settle in Texas. The deal was they'd get cheap land, and in return, Mexico would get what it desperately needed, a populated, developed, and, they hoped, loyal northern buffer state.
The goal here was crystal clear. The Mexican government truly believed that these new settlers would basically act as a shield, creating a stable region that was firmly under Mexican authority. It was a huge strategic gamble, but they thought it could solve their frontier problem for good.
But listen, this was not just an open house party. This invitation came with some very specific, completely non-negotiable rules. If you wanted the land, you had to become a Mexican citizen, you had to obey all Mexican laws, and you had to officially adopt Catholicism. These weren't just suggestions. They were safeguards designed to make sure Texas stayed culturally and politically Mexican.
So, on paper, it sounds like a pretty clever plan, right? Well, it started to fall apart almost right away, and one single issue became the explosive core of the whole conflict.
And this right here is where it all goes wrong. On one side, you have Mexican law. Mexico had abolished slavery. It was a core national principle. But on the other side, you have the reality. American settlers, mostly from the South, were bringing enslaved people with them because they saw it as essential for their cotton-based economy. So this wasn't just them breaking a rule. No, this was a direct challenge to the fundamental values and the very authority of the Mexican government.
And the problems just kept piling up. The American settler population just exploded, and they really weren't trying to fit in. They kept speaking English, they showed pretty much zero loyalty to Mexican institutions, and for the most part, they just ignored Mexican cultural practices. The gap between the two cultures was just getting wider and wider every single day.
You can just imagine the dawning horror for Mexican officials. They started to realize this wasn't some manageable immigration issue anymore. No, they were dealing with a massive and rapidly growing population inside their own country that flat out did not accept their right to be in charge.
Okay, but this conflict in Texas wasn't just happening in a bubble. To really understand why things escalated the way they did, we have to zoom out. We need to look at the powerful ideas and forces that were sweeping across the continent at the exact same time.
So, you have to ask yourself, right? Was this really just a local fight between some unhappy settlers and a far-off government? Or was there something much, much bigger at play here? An ideology that was shaping how these settlers saw their own destiny in Texas.
This image, this political cartoon, just perfectly captures the mood in the United States at the time. You've got Uncle Sam, looking all big and confident, just striding across the entire Western Hemisphere with a giant club that says Monroe Doctrine. And that one word at the bottom says it all: expansion.
Now, the Monroe Doctrine was a huge statement. Officially, it was a warning to Europe to stay out of the Americas. But unofficially, it sent a message to everyone else too.
The U.S. saw itself as the big dog in the neighborhood. And for those American settlers down in Texas, this wasn't just some abstract foreign policy. It fueled this growing belief in American exceptionalism, the idea that their way of life was destined to spread no matter what Mexican law said.
And that's the tragic irony in all of this. Mexico's brilliant plan to secure its frontier had completely backfired. By inviting these settlers in, they'd accidentally created the perfect environment for their own authority to be challenged and, in the end, to completely collapse.
So what started as a domestic policy to fix a border problem ended with Mexico losing a gigantic piece of its territory. But the story doesn't stop there. What happened in Texas became a kind of blueprint, really the first major chapter in a much bigger story of American expansion and influence, a story that would soon play out all across Latin America. So the real question isn't just what happened next for Texas, it's where that ambition would turn its eyes next.